Hello, my name is Amy Halbing. I am 15 years old and I am currently in 9th grade at Omni Montessori School. For a few years now, I've been pretty interested in the brain, and as the years go by, my fascination just progresses. That's why I'm here today, to tell you about the optimism bias and other psychological effects. The optimism bias is commonly defined as the belief that one's chances of experiencing a negative event are lower and a positive event higher than that of one's peers. I can only really speak for myself, but I've always thought of myself as a realist and not so much a pessimist or an optimist. But I'd like to invite you to think of your life 10 to 15 years from now. Where do you see yourself? Now, when asked this question, most people think thoughts such as, I think I'll finally have that promotion, or I think I'll finally have done that thing I've always wanted to do. But does anyone think thoughts such as, I think I'll be involved in a rough car crash, or I think I'll be divorced by then? The fact is that currently in the Western world, divorce rates are at roughly 50%, meaning about half of married couples will get divorced, so not all of our outcomes can end positively. That is what this talk is about. That the underlying fact that somewhere within us is the optimism bias, whether we believe it is there or not. Now, all sorts of testing has been done with the optimism bias, but one testing was really based off of one question. Are humans the only ones who are able to experience the optimism bias? At Newcastle University, they trained birds to push a lever at a 2-second sound and at a 10-second sound. At a 2-second sound, they were given a reward if they pushed the lever. And at the 10-second sound, they were offered no reward. The birds were obviously pretty positive about gaining a reward and pretty negative about not getting any. But that wasn't the end of the test. The testing continued, in which they played a sound that was in between 2 and 10 seconds. If the birds pushed the lever, it meant that they were optimistic about getting a reward. The birds astoundingly not only showed optimistic results about a sound that was in between 2 and 10 seconds, but also about sounds that were longer than 10 seconds. But not all the birds were the same. The birds were split into 2 groups, Group A and Group B. Group A were offered luxurious living conditions with plenty of free space to fly and plenty of high-class food, while the birds in Group B were offered smaller cages and less food. The birds in Group B displayed what is called depressive realism. Now, depressive realism is one of those words that you can really, or terms that you can really figure out what it means by itself. It stems from depression and being realistic. But basically, when I speak of it, it's basically a lack of an optimism bias, but it's not the complete lack. Okay, now, how do these birds relate to humans? And how does depressive realism tie in with the optimism bias? Well, people with mild to moderate forms of depression often suffer from something that is called cognitive distortions. Cognitive distortions is another one of those terms that you can figure out what they mean. They're basically distortions caused by the mind. Now, these distortions can cause people with depression to make events or details that people without depression may deem as insignificant to seem much worse than they really are. Now, don't get me wrong, just like the optimism bias, everyone goes through some form of cognitive distortions, whether it be over or underestimating your own abilities or black and white thinking. Psychologists use the term black and white thinking to describe thinking in infinites, such as, I did bad on this quiz, I always do bad on quizzes, or she said she didn't want to hang out with me today, she never wants to hang out with me. Another form of cognitive distortion is what psychologists like to refer to as mind reading. Mind reading is basically jumping to conclusions about somebody else's thoughts without any prior knowledge. So let's take the previous example. She said she didn't want to hang out with me today, and add something such as, she doesn't want to hang out with me because she hates me. Now, take note that these aren't the only forms of cognitive distortions. There are actually over 15 forms, but these are some of the most common types. Now, is it possible that instead of having cognitive distortions, people with mild to moderate forms of depression are seeing the world as it really is? Or is it possible that instead of having depressive realism, people with mild to moderate forms of depression only have cognitive distortions? Now, going back to the optimism bias. The optimism bias, as I've mentioned before, is the belief that one's chances of experiencing a negative event are lower and a positive event higher than another's. But an interesting effect of the optimism bias is that we are more realistic towards our own neighbors, coworkers, and peers. Many professional studies have been done about this, but I did my own. In the professional studies, 90% of people were optimistic about their own futures or their own families, while only 17% were optimistic about other families or other futures. In my own study, 80% of people were optimistic about their own futures, while 28% were optimistic about others. So, according to these countless clinical studies, we are also optimistic about the lives of our own families and occasionally very close friends. So, could the fact that we are more realistic about our peers possibly be a form of depressive realism? Now, take a look at this picture. I think it pretty accurately describes the difference of the optimism bias and depressive realism. The picture on the left is contorted. The perception is jagged. That's the optimism bias. In the picture on the right, the perception is straight and there's no room for error. The picture on the right is depressive realism. While optimism is an essential part of humanity, Helen Keller herself said, "Optimism is the faith that leads to achievement. No pessimist ever discovered the secret of the stars, or sailed to an uncharted land, or opened a new doorway for the human spirit. But it can also lead to some very bad decisions. For instance, have you ever heard of vertigo when flying? When pilots experience vertigo, it's much like the symptoms of highway hypnosis. The pilots are no longer able to figure out what is up and what is down. The pilots may be plummeting into the ocean, yet they believe that they are flying properly. Although the optimism bias is generally considered a good thing, this is an example of how it is also not. The pilot's brain tricked him into thinking he was flying properly in a positive way that ended negatively. So, the next time you have to make a decision, I would like to ask you to think about the possible consequences while not abandoning optimism. Thank you.